The quiet hum of the restaurant was a sound Julian Vance knew by heart. It was the sound he'd engineered, the gentle sizzle of patties on the grill, the soft beep of the fry station timer, the low murmur of satisfied customers. It was the sound of his success, of Vansberger, the empire he had built from a single grill in his father's garage. Today, however, another sound cut through the familiar harmony, a sound so small it was almost imperceptible, yet it landed in his gut like a stone. Silence. Not the comfortable silence of a lull in business, but a taut, stretched silence emanating from the young woman behind the counter. Her name tag read, Helena. She moved with a robotic efficiency, her hands assembling his order, but her eyes were glassy, fixed on a point somewhere beyond him. As she slid the tray across the counter, a single tear escaped and traced a silent path down her cheek. She swiped it away with a practiced flick of her wrist, her expression never changing. It was a gesture of profound, private sorrow, performed in public as if she were entirely alone. Julian felt a jolt, a dissonance between the glossy brand promise he sold and the raw pain he was witnessing. "That'll be $9.57, she said, her voice a monotone whisper, hollowed out. He handed her his debit card, a generic, unbranded one he kept for moments like these, moments of anonymous observation. She swiped it. A harsh, electronic chirp split the air. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her gaze dropping to the worn linoleum floor. "It's declined." He knew there were thousands of dollars in that account. A cold knot formed in his stomach. This was an anomaly. An impossibility. Before he could speak, a presence materialized beside Elena. A man, stout and imposing, with a manager's polo shirt stretched tight across his chest. His name tag read, Davis. He didn't look at Julian. He looked at Elena, a long, unblinking stare that seemed to suck the very air from around her. She flinched, a barely visible tremor. "Is there a problem here?" Davis's voice was deceptively mild, but it carried a chilling weight. He took the card from Elena's trembling hand and swiped it himself. Another angry chirp. He handed it back to Julian. "Machine's been acting up," he said, the lie as smooth and greasy as the condensation on the soda fountain. His eyes, however, never left Elena. They were small, hard chips of ice, pinning her in place. Julian watched the exchange, the unspoken current of fear that passed between them. He felt like an intruder on a scene he wasn't meant to understand. This isn't a faulty card reader, Julian thought, his mind racing. This is a performance. But for whose benefit? And why? He saw Elena's knuckles, white as bone as she gripped the edge of the counter. He saw the subtle way she angled her body away from Davis, a silent plea for space. The tear was gone, but its ghost remained, a stain on the carefully constructed artifice of his company. He paid with cash, his mind a whirl of questions. The burger on his tray, the symbol of his life's work, suddenly felt tasteless, obscene. He took his seat in a corner booth, the plastic cool against his skin, and watched. He saw Davis linger near the registers, his presence a form of surveillance. He saw the other employees moving with a similar, unnatural quietness, their shoulders hunched, their eyes downcast. The hum of the restaurant was still there, but now Julian could hear the discord beneath it. It was the sound of fear. And it was happening in his house. The heavy oak door of his office clicked shut, the sound echoing in the cavernous space. Outside, the city glittered, a sprawling testament to commerce and ambition. On his desk, meticulously arranged, were the latest performance metrics for Vansberger International. Revenue was up. Stock prices were soaring. A glossy magazine on the corner of his desk featured his face on the cover, a bold headline proclaiming him, the people's CEO. Julian stared at his own smiling image and felt a wave of nausea. The man on that cover was a stranger. A liar. He couldn't shake the image of Elena's silent tear, the oppressive weight of Davis's stare. Those were the real metrics, the ones that didn't appear on any spreadsheet. He had spent his career talking about our Vansberger family, about dignity, respect, and opportunity. He'd built the brand on the story of his own father, who had worked 2 low-wage jobs to give him a chance, and who had always told him, a man's worth isn't in his title, Julian. It's in how he treats the people he's responsible for. Had he become the very thing his father had railed against? A man in a tower, so high up he could no longer see the ground. The thought was a shard of glass in his conscience. He had built a system, but he no longer knew how it truly operated. He had trusted his executives, his regional managers, his data. He had trusted the reports that told him everything was fine. But the silence in that restaurant told a different story. It spoke of a sickness, a rot that he had allowed to fester in the dark. I have to know, he thought, his jaw tightening. I have to see it for myself. Not as the CEO. But as one of them. The decision settled over him, not as a choice, but as a necessity. A penance. He buzzed his executive assistant, Maria, a woman whose loyalty he trusted implicitly. Maria, I need you to do something for me. And it needs to be completely off the books. He explained his plan, his voice low and steady. He needed a new identity. A backstory. A place on the payroll at the Southside Vansburger, store 1138. He needed to become invisible. Maria was silent for a long moment, the only sound the faint hum of the intercom. He knew what she was thinking. It was reckless. Unprecedented. What name will you be using, sir? She finally asked, her tone betraying no judgment, only a quiet efficiency that he had always valued. Just J, he said. No last name. Just J. That night, he went home and stood before his closet, filled with bespoke suits and handmade Italian shoes. He pushed them all aside and pulled out a pair of worn jeans he hadn't touched in years and a faded concert t-shirt. He looked at his reflection in the mirror. The sharp, confident lines of the CEO began to blur, replaced by someone older, more tired. Someone who looked like he could use a job mopping floors. The transformation had begun. He wasn't Julian Vance, billionaire founder, anymore. He was Jay, and he was about to clock in for the most important shift of his life. The back door of the Southside Vansburger creaked open into a narrow, dimly lit hallway that smelled of stale grease and disinfectant. The air was thick and heavy, a stark contrast to the filtered, climate-controlled atmosphere of his corporate headquarters. This was the engine room, the gritty reality behind the bright, welcoming facade. Mr. Davis stood there, clipboard in hand, his expression a flat mask of impatience. He barely glanced at the man standing before him. To Davis, he was just another body to fill a slot on the schedule. You're Jay, Davis stated, not asked. You're on cleaning duty. Floors, tables, bathrooms. Don't be slow. Don't be stupid. Clock in. The words were clipped, stripped of any courtesy. It was an orientation delivered as a series of commands. Julian, now Jay, simply nodded, keeping his eyes lowered. He could feel Davis's gaze on him, a probing, dismissive assessment. He was being catalogued and filed away as unimportant, which was exactly what he wanted. He punched his time card into the clunky, analog clock on the wall, a relic he thought they'd phased out years ago, and the machine made a satisfying, solid thunk. He was officially on the inside. He spent the first few hours in a state of hyper-awareness. Every detail, every interaction, was a piece of a puzzle he was just beginning to assemble. He saw Elena at the front counter, her movements still precise and withdrawn. She never met Davis's eye. When the manager walked past, her shoulders would tighten almost imperceptibly, a silent, conditioned response to a predator. The other employees operated in a similar bubble of quiet tension. There was no friendly chatter, no camaraderie. There was only the hum of the machinery and the weight of unspoken rules. The silence was a language, and everyone here was fluent. It's not peace, Julian thought, wringing out a mop in a slop sink. It's suppression. A lid clamped down tight on a boiling pot. He focused on his work, his movements deliberate. Mopping the dining room floor, he found a rhythm, the back and forth motion becoming a kind of meditation. It gave him the perfect cover to observe. He saw Davis correct a young employee, not with words, but by leaning in close, his voice a low hiss that made the boy flinch. He saw the fear in the boy's eyes, the quick, darting glance to see who was watching. No one intervened. No one made a sound. In the kitchen, a man named Samuel worked the grill. He was older, with deep lines etched around his eyes and a calm, centered presence that stood out in the anxious environment. He moved with an economy of motion, flipping burgers, salting fries, his hands sure and steady. He didn't speak, but he saw everything. When Jay came back to empty a trash can, their eyes met for a fraction of a second. Samuel gave him a single, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't a welcome. It was an acknowledgement. You are here. I see you. In that fleeting moment, Jay felt a flicker of something other than oppression. It was resilience. Samuel had found a way to exist in this place without being consumed by it. Jay understood then that his investigation wasn't just about finding the rot, it was also about finding the people who had managed to survive it. The days bled into a routine of bleach and grime, of quiet observation from the periphery. Jay learned the rhythms of the restaurant, the ebbs and flows of the lunch and dinner rushes. But beneath the surface-level operations, he started to sense the workings of a hidden, secondary system. It was a system built on small thefts, subtle manipulations that were nearly impossible to spot in isolation. The first concrete clue came during the end-of-shift cash-out. Elena would count her drawer, her lips moving silently as she tallied the bills and coins. She would write the total on a slip of paper. But she wasn't allowed to take it to the back office. Davis would collect the drawer and the slip himself. He would disappear into his office for 10 minutes, the door firmly shut. When he emerged, he would hand back a receipt from the official point-of-sale system. More than once, Jay saw Elena's face fall as she looked at the official receipt. There was always a discrepancy, a small shortage attributed to clerical error, or a miskeyed order. It was never more than a few dollars, just enough to be frustrating but not enough to justify a formal complaint. It was a tax, levied by fear. Jay's suspicions solidified when he was cleaning the break room late one night. In the bottom of a trash can, beneath crumpled napkins and empty sugar packets, he found a pay stub. It was folded into a tiny, angry square. He carefully smoothed it out. The name on it was Maria S. He recognized her as one of the quiet kitchen staff. He looked at the numbers. The gross pay was what he expected for her hours. But the deductions were baffling. Alongside the standard taxes, there was a line item that simply read, Uniform Service Fee, $25, another read, Employee Wellness Contribution, $15. Julian knew for a fact that Vansberger provided uniforms for free. And there was no such thing as an employee wellness contribution, it was fiction. It was theft, laundered through the payroll system, legitimized by a printed line on a piece of paper. This isn't just one greedy manager skimming from the till, Jay thought, the crumpled stub feeling heavy in his hand. This is organized. The fees, the doctored cash-outs, it's a machine. He realized Davis wasn't just a bully, he was an operator. A local enforcer for a much larger, more insidious scheme. The late-night quiet of the empty restaurant felt different now. It was no longer just oppressive, it was predatory. The building itself seemed complicit, its walls holding the secrets of 1,000 tiny cuts, each one draining the lifeblood from the people who worked there. The discarded pay stub wasn't just paper, it was a confession. And Jay knew he had to find more. He had to follow the money, because money always leaves a trail. The trail, he suspected, led far beyond the four walls of store 1138. Jay understood that fear was the currency of this place, and direct questions would only get him stonewalled or fired. He needed allies, but trust was a resource more scarce than anything else. He decided to start with Samuel, the stoic grill cook. Samuel was a fixture, a man who seemed to have weathered countless storms by becoming as immovable as a mountain. He radiated a quiet integrity that the oppressive atmosphere couldn't penetrate. For days, Jay worked alongside him without pushing. He made sure the grill station was always stocked, that the floors around it were clean. He learned Samuel's rhythm, anticipating his need for a fresh stack of buns or a clean spatula. He offered respect not through words, but through action. He was just Jay, the new cleaner, doing his job well. One afternoon, during a lull between the lunch and dinner rush, Jay was wiping down the stainless steel prep table. Samuel was methodically scraping the grill. The only sounds were the scrape of metal on metal and the hum of the ventilation fan. "Found a pay stub in the trash the other night," Jay said, his voice casual, directed at the table he was cleaning. "Had some weird fees on it. Uniform service fee or something." He didn't look at Samuel. He just kept wiping. The scraping stopped. The silence that followed was thick with meaning. Jay could feel Samuel's eyes on him, studying him. He braced himself for a dismissal, a warning to mind his own business. Instead, after a long moment, the scraping resumed. Jay finished his task and moved on, a knot of disappointment in his stomach. Maybe he had misread the man. An hour later, as Jay was taking a full trash liner out to the dumpster, Samuel stepped in his path. He held out a gnarled, grease-stained hand. In his palm was a small, neatly folded piece of paper. He pressed it into Jay's hand, his fingers firm and calloused. Their eyes met again, and this time, there was a clear message in Samuel's gaze. It was a warning, a challenge, and a sliver of hope. "Watch the clock on the wall," Samuel said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. It was the most he'd ever said to Jay. "Then watch the paper they give you. The numbers lie," and with that, he turned and went back to his grill. Jay waited until he was outside by the dumpsters to unfold the paper. It was a schedule from the previous month. Next to the officially printed shift times, there were dozens of tiny, handwritten annotations. An in time of 8:58 a.m. was next to an official, punched, time of 9:15 a.m. An out time of 10:05 p.m. was next to an official time of 10 p.m. It was meticulous. It was undeniable. It was time theft, orchestrated and systematic, stealing minutes from every employee, every single day. Minutes that added up to hours, to dollars, to groceries they couldn't buy and bills they couldn't pay. Samuel hadn't just given him a piece of paper. He had given him the Rosetta Stone for this place. He had given him proof. He was Jay's first ally. And he had done it without fanfare, without expecting thanks. He had done it because it was the right thing to do. Jay folded the paper carefully and tucked it into his pocket. It felt like a weapon. The trust he had earned from Samuel emboldened him. Now, he had to reach Elena. She was the emotional epicenter of this crisis, the face of the silent suffering he had first witnessed. But her fear was a wall, thick and high. He knew a direct approach would only make her retreat further. He had to wait for the right moment, a moment when the cracks in the wall were already showing. That moment came on a Tuesday. It was brutally busy, the lunch rush relentless. A customer claimed Elena had shortchanged him by $5. It was a loud, obnoxious accusation that drew stares. Davis swooped in immediately, his presence a thundercloud. He didn't defend his employee. He pulled her till drawer without a word and took it to the back office. Jay watched from the dining room as Elena stood frozen at her post, her face pale, her hands trembling. When Davis returned, he spoke to her in a low, vicious tone that Jay couldn't hear but could feel from across the room. Later, Jay found her in the tiny, windowless break room. She was sitting on a plastic chair, staring at the scuffed floor, trying and failing to hold back tears. This was the moment. He didn't say anything at first. He just walked to the vending machine, bought a bottle of water, and set it on the small table in front of her. The plastic bottle made a soft clinking sound, and she looked up, startled. Her eyes were red-rimmed and full of a deep, weary shame. "He's wrong," Jay said softly, leaning against the opposite wall to give her space. "What he does. It's wrong, Elena flinched, looking toward the door as if expecting Davis to appear. Please, she whispered, her voice cracking. Don't, I'm not going to say anything to him, Jay assured her. I just want you to know that you're not crazy. You're not imagining it. He decided to take a risk, to offer a piece of his own truth to earn hers. When I was younger, he began, his voice quiet and reflective, I worked a grill at a place like this. Not as nice. My boss was a cheat. He'd find reasons to dock our pay every week. A broken glass, a wasted order. We were all scared of him. Too scared to speak up, he looked at her, letting the story settle in the small room. He saw a flicker of recognition in her eyes. He wasn't just Jay the cleaner anymore, he was someone who understood. What happened? She asked, her voice barely audible. One day, he fired a kid for being 10 minutes late, even though the kid's mom was in the hospital. We'd all had enough. We all walked out. Together, he paused. He couldn't run the place by himself. He had to hire us all back. And he never docked our pay again. He wasn't just telling a story, he was planting a seed. The idea that silence was a choice, not a permanent condition. Elena picked up the water bottle, her fingers tracing the condensation. The tears finally came, not in a silent trickle, but in quiet, wrenching sobs. It's the tips, she choked out, the words tumbling out in a rush. The credit card tips. They go into the system, but we never see them. He says the company keeps them for processing fees, but I know he takes them. And if the drawer is ever over, even by $1, he takes that too. He says it's for the store fund, but there is no fund. It was the final piece of the puzzle. Wage theft. Time theft. And now, tip theft. It was a trifecta of exploitation. Jay felt a cold, righteous anger settle deep in his bones. He had his evidence. He had his witnesses. And now, he had his cause. That night, Julian Vance ceased to be Jay. He returned to his penthouse, the scent of industrial cleaner still clinging to his clothes. He showered, scrubbing away the grime of the day, but he couldn't wash away the anger. He sat at his home office terminal, the city lights a distant, indifferent galaxy below. The crumpled pay stub, Samuel's annotated schedule, and Elena's whispered confession lay on the desk beside him. They were crude, simple pieces of evidence, but together they painted a damning picture. It was time to connect the dots on a corporate scale. He knew Davis wasn't smart enough to engineer the payroll deductions. The uniform service fee and employee wellness contribution were too clean, too official. That required access to the company's central payroll system, a system Julian himself had helped design. It was encrypted, firewalled, and accessible only to the highest levels of the finance and operations departments. Using his CEO-level credentials, he logged into the back-end of the Vansberger Human Resources portal. He felt like a ghost haunting his own machine. He started by pulling the payroll records for store 1138. There they were, the fraudulent fees, systematically applied to every employee except Davis. He cross-referenced with other stores in the district, then other districts in the region. The pattern was the same. It was a virus, spreading through the lower-waged tiers of his company. It was a conspiracy. Who had the authority? Who had the motive? His mind cycled through the faces on his executive board. He ran a systems audit, tracing the digital footprints of the module that created the deductions. The code was buried deep, masked as a routine software patch installed 6 months prior. He tracked the authorization protocol for that patch. His heart sank. The override code belonged to one person. Marcus Thorne. His chief operating officer. Marcus. Sleek, confident, an MBA from Wharton. The man Julian had trusted to handle the day-to-day running of the company while he focused on the bigger picture. The man who sat across from him in board meetings and talked about maximizing efficiency, and streamlining labor costs, the cold, corporate jargon now took on a sinister new meaning. Streamlining labor costs meant stealing from people like Elena and Samuel. Marcus was the architect. Davis was just a local franchisee of the corruption. Thorne had built a system that skimmed fractions of a dollar from thousands of employees, funneling the money into a discretionary slush fund disguised as operational overages. It was brilliant in its cruelty, virtually untraceable unless you were looking for it from the ground up. The realization hit Julian like a physical blow. The rot didn't just start in the middle, it went all the way to the suite next to his own. He felt a profound sense of betrayal, not just by Marcus, but by his own ignorance. He had been so focused on the view from the top that he hadn't noticed the foundations were being eaten away. He pulled up Thorne's personnel file. He saw the glowing reviews he himself had written. He saw the stock options worth millions. And he felt nothing but a cold, clear resolve. He copied all the files onto a secured, encrypted USB drive, the payroll data, the system logs, the authorization codes. The digital evidence was irrefutable. Tomorrow, he wouldn't be going to work as Jay the cleaner. He would be going as Julian Vance, the owner. And he was coming to collect. The next morning, a black sedan, polished to a mirror shine, pulled up to the curb in front of the Southside Vansburger. The employees inside, prepping for the lunch rush, barely noticed. But then the back door opened, and Julian Vance stepped out. He was not wearing faded jeans and a t-shirt. He was in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, his presence radiating an authority that was palpable even from a distance. He walked to the entrance, his stride measured and purposeful. The small bell above the door chimed, a sound that usually signaled the arrival of a customer. Today, it sounded like a toll. Every head in the restaurant turned. The employees froze. They saw Jay, their quiet cleaning guy, but he was wearing the face of the man from the posters in the break room, the founder, the CEO. The cognitive dissonance was stunning. Elena's hand flew to her mouth. Samuel, at his grill, simply stopped and watched, his expression unreadable. Mr. Davis was the last to see him. He came bustling out of his office, an annoyed look on his face. "What's all the—" His words died in his throat. His face went slack, the color draining from it as he registered who was standing in the middle of his dining room. Julian's eyes, cold and direct, met his. "Mr. Davis," Julian said, his voice calm but carrying the force of a battering ram. "My office." Now, he didn't wait for a reply. He walked straight past the stunned manager, past the counter, and into the cramped, greasy office that Davis had used as his personal kingdom. The room smelled of stale coffee and fear. He sat in Davis's chair, the worn vinyl groaning under his weight. He gestured to the flimsy guest chair opposite him. Davis entered, stumbling slightly, his bravado completely shattered. "Sir. Mr. Vance. I didn't know, call Elena and Samuel in here, please," Julian commanded, cutting him off. A moment later, they stood hesitantly in the doorway, their eyes wide with a mixture of terror and dawning hope. Julian looked at them, his expression softening for a moment. "It's okay," he said gently. "Please, come in." He turned his attention back to Davis, who was now visibly sweating. Julian placed the encrypted USB drive on the desk. "I know about the time theft," he said, his voice level. "I know about the tip theft. And I know about the fraudulent service fees." Davis's face crumpled. He opened his mouth to speak, to lie, to bargain, but Julian raised a hand. "It's over." He then took out his phone and dialed a number. He put it on speaker. "Marcus, good morning," he said. The voice that came through the speaker was smooth, confident, and familiar. "Julian. What a surprise. To what do I owe the pleasure?" "I'm down at store 1138, Julian said, his eyes locked on Davis's. "I'm sitting here with Mr. Davis. We're having a fascinating conversation about your labor cost streamlining initiative. The one you implemented 6 months ago. There was a sudden, dead silence on the other end of the line. The polished confidence in Marcus Thorne's voice evaporated, replaced by the cold, stark sound of panic. In that silence, everyone in the small office understood. The architect had just been connected to his crime. The silence from Marcus Thorne's end of the line stretched for a few seconds, an eternity in the cramped office. When he finally spoke, his voice was tight, strained. "Julian, I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding. Perhaps a miscommunication from a local manager." "There's no misunderstanding, Marcus," Julian cut in, his voice like ice. "I have the system logs. I have the authorization codes. I have the payroll records from 212 stores where you implemented a program to systematically steal from our lowest paid employees. You built a machine to take money from people like Elena, who works 60 hours a week to support her family, and Samuel, who has given this company 20 years of his life." He glanced at Elena and Samuel, who stood watching, their fear slowly being replaced by a dawning sense of vindication. Davis had sunk into his chair, a man utterly broken. "It was a margin protection strategy," Thorne stammered, his corporate jargon now sounding like the pathetic excuse it was. "Unconventional, perhaps, but designed to ensure shareholder value in a competitive market." "Shareholder value?" Julian's voice rose for the first time, filled with a righteous fury. "You stole from children's birthday money. You stole from rent payments. You did it from the comfort of your corner office and you called it a strategy. You betrayed every single principle this company was built on. You betrayed me." He didn't need to shout. The weight of his words was enough. "It's over, Marcus. You're done." He ended the call, the abrupt silence leaving a ringing in the air. He looked at Davis. "You too." He had already made his next move before he even arrived at the restaurant. While driving there, he had forwarded the entire encrypted file to Rebecca Farrow, a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist he trusted. The file contained everything: Thorne's digital signature, Davis's meticulously documented local malfeasance via Samuel's notes, financial records, and a prepared, signed statement from Julian himself, taking full responsibility for the failure of his oversight and outlining the steps he would take to make it right. He stood up and walked toward the door, pausing beside Elena and Samuel. "This is your store," he said to them, his voice now gentle. "From now on, it will be a place of respect. I promise you that." He walked out of the office and through the silent restaurant. As he stepped out into the bright sunlight, his phone vibrated. A news alert. He glanced at the screen. On-screen text flared to life for the audience to see: Vansberger CEO uncovers and exposes massive wage theft conspiracy within own company. Coup Marcus Thorne implicated. The public reveal was complete. The story was out in the world, a cleansing fire that would burn away the rot. The machine of silence and fear had been dismantled, not with a whisper, but with a roar that would echo from the stock market to every Vansberger kitchen in the country. He had exposed the wound, and now, the healing could begin. The fallout was swift and decisive. News channels ran the story on a loop. On-screen text showed headlines flashing across the screen: Thorne fired, faces federal investigation, Vansberger stock dips, then rebounds on CEO's transparency, nationwide audit launched at fast food giant. The public narrative wasn't one of corporate failure, but of profound corporate responsibility, led by a CEO who chose integrity over silence. Cameras captured Marcus Thorne being escorted from the gleaming corporate tower, his face a mask of disbelief. They caught a humbled Mr. Davis leaving his local store for the last time. Julian Vance, however, avoided the cameras. His work was not in the headlines, but in the rebuilding. He immediately established a multi-million-dollar restitution fund to repay every cent that had been stolen from his employees, with interest. He overhauled the entire regional management structure, instituting new, rigorous ethical training programs. He created a truly anonymous, third-party whistleblower hotline, and he promoted leaders from within who, like Samuel, had demonstrated integrity under pressure. 6 months later, the South Side Vansberger was unrecognizable. The dim, oppressive lighting had been replaced with bright, warm fixtures. The walls were freshly painted. But the most significant change was the atmosphere. It was filled with the sound Julian had almost forgotten, the easy laughter of the crew, the friendly chatter between employees and customers. A new manager, a warm and competent woman named Sarah, was patiently showing a teenager how to work the register. In the kitchen, Samuel stood at his grill, no longer a silent sentinel, but the respected elder of the crew, a quiet smile playing on his lips as he showed a new cook how to get the perfect sear on a patty. Elena was at the front counter, not as a cashier, but as the newly promoted shift supervisor. Her eyes were clear and bright, her voice confident as she helped a customer with a complicated order. Julian Vance walked in, wearing simple jeans and a polo shirt. He was no longer undercover, but he wasn't there as the CEO either. He was just a customer. He got in line. When he reached the counter, Elena's face broke into a genuine, brilliant smile. "The usual, Julian?" she asked. He smiled back. "You know it," he paid for his meal and sat in the same corner booth where his journey had begun. He unwrapped his burger and took a bite. It tasted different now. It tasted of hard-won integrity. It tasted of redemption. He looked around at the bustling, happy restaurant, at the people he had almost failed. He had built an empire, lost his way, and then fought to reclaim its soul. He had learned that true leadership isn't about sitting in a high tower looking at spreadsheets. It's about having the courage to walk on the ground floor, to listen to the silence, and to protect the people who place their trust in you. The camera holds on his face, a look of quiet, profound gratitude. The narrator's voice, warm and empathetic, begins. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the voice that rises in the silence. It's the strength to stand up when you're told to stay down, to speak truth when lies are easier. The world changes one act of courage at a time. If you've ever found that voice, or helped someone else find theirs, leave a dot in the comments so we know we're not alone.